Well, a very good evening, good afternoon, good morning, depending on where in the world you are tuning in from. My name is Adrian Read, and I'm really pleased to welcome you to this BA community webinar, which is, of course, the first webinar of 2021. I nearly said 2020 there. 2020 feels like a year that didn't really start or happen in many ways, doesn't it? So I hope everyone, I hope you're all well. I'm really pleased to say we're going to be talking about a really interesting topic, a topic that I don't know a huge amount about, but one that I was really interested to find more about. We're going to be talking about anthropology and its relevance for business analysis. So we have three speakers with us today. We have Zara Sheldrake, Anushka Read, and Nick de Voil. I will ask them to give a brief intro to themselves in just a second. But just before we do that, as any of you that have been on one of these webinars before will know, we're going to have a sort of shared note-taking, a sort of shared mural board. And the idea behind this is that you can add your own notes as we go along. So I'm just going to put it on the screen over here. I will put the link for this in the chat in just a moment. But what you can do, you can literally double click on the canvas. And if somebody says something interesting, I'm sure many people will say many interesting things, you can add it there. And then you can kind of move it around and group it. And we'll bring this up at about halfway through the session, and we'll see what sort of ideas are particularly resonating with you all. So I will just put that in the chat for you now. So feel free to click through to that mural. Also, this is absolutely interactive. So please do ask questions as we go along, and we'll cover as many of those as we can. So let's kick off. Be good to get to know each other, to just know a little bit about who you are and why this particularly resonates with you before we get into the topic in detail. So Zara, who are you, where do you come from, and why is this of interest?
Hello everybody, thank you so much for joining us. Thanks for the intro, Adrian. So I'm Zara Sheldrake. I'm a business analyst based in Cambridge, currently working for the wonderful University of Cambridge, which is quite a privilege, I have to say. I've got quite an eclectic set of hobbies and interests, a lot of which involve doing online learning, or back in the days when we were allowed to, a bit of classroom learning outside too. And anthropology has been an interest of mine for a long time. And like any good BA, I started thinking about, can we learn something from it and bring it into what we're doing here?
Fantastic, excellent. Thanks, Zara. Anushka.
Hello, I'm Anushka Read. I'm 22, and I graduated this summer from the University of Essex studying social anthropology with human rights. That was the big pull for me because I just love anthropology, and in September of 2020 I joined Aviva as an apprentice BA, and this is where my whole journey is stemmed from.
Fantastic. So a real life anthropologist and business analyst as well. So fantastic. And last but by no means least, Nick.
Hi everybody, I'm Nick de Voil. I'm a consultant and a trainer. I'm very interested in business analysis. I'm very interested in user experience, and I find that they're really two different sides of the same coin. And I've become increasingly interested in anthropology, sociology, psychology, all the social sciences really. Probably going back to when I did my master's in human-computer interaction. Starting about 12 years ago. So yeah, really excited to be here talking to some people that actually know what they're talking about.
Well, Nick, you do yourself a disservice. I was looking on my bookshelf to see if I can grab it, but I don't think. Oh, yes, it is here. You say the thing you forgot to mention. You mentioned user experience, but you've actually written a book about it for BCS. And a very good book as well. So do get your hands on that if you're into the UX side. But I digress. Yes, thumbs up there from me. Okay, so let's have a talk. And do remember, if you're tuning in live, you can ask questions as we go along. So I thought it would be useful to talk a little bit about where this idea came from. And Zara, you wrote a really fantastic article about anthropology, and it must have been 2 or 3 months ago now, and it really, I mean, it really, I think it opened my mind to this. What inspired you to write that?
Oh, well, thank you. You flatter me, Adrian. It was a passable article, and that's on my LinkedIn page if anyone wants to go have a look. I think, like many people, when the pandemic hit and a lot of your sort of hobbies and your social interactions went away, I just started to look for things to fill the time. And one of those was an introduction to anthropology course offered by the incredible FutureLearn, who just do a lot of free online learning courses. And as I was going through this, they kept mentioning the techniques involved in sort of ethnography, so the study of societies. And they were techniques that sounded very familiar to me as a business analyst, things like listening, but the sort of real active listening to understand what someone's not saying as well as what they are, and things like observation, which I think if we had the time, all BAs would probably pick as their upfront technique for most of the discovery work we do. And I just, yeah, I'm one of those people that when I have an idea, I start writing, and if it becomes a big enough thing, I'll just post it somewhere and see if anyone else wants to talk about it. So yeah, that's sort of where the article and the idea to gather a few people together and talk about it came from. And then here we are today. You're on mute, Adrian.
Oh gosh, that's an awful thing to do for the host, isn't it? I mean, come on, that's outrageous, being on mute. 2021, we should be so over that. So, I mean, this is a good point to bring you in, Anushka, because this is an area that you've sort of studied, and you've of course now become a business analyst. So, I mean, what sort of connections do you see? Do you see them as sort of connected and relevant?
And because I'm on the BA Apprentice course, when you go through the actual Assist KD book, you have these techniques of observation and ethnographic study. So ethnographic study is where you, in an anthropology world, you submerge yourself in another culture, whether that be one local to you or like totally from around the world. So when I saw it in the business analysis book, I interpreted it as you are putting yourself in the shoes of someone else who you're working with or your stakeholder, and you're really understanding from their perspective, so you don't have your own bias. And that was something that really drew me to Zara's article, which I thought was also amazing.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's a really quite interesting angle, isn't it? The sort of removal of bias, or looking objectively and getting into stakeholders' shoes, and I mean, I guess bringing you Nick into the conversation as well, because you talked about user experience and sociology and psychology. So what springs to my mind there is the question of how can we best be as objective business analysts as we can be, knowing that objectivity is difficult because of cognitive biases and our worldviews and all these sorts of things. So with bringing in perhaps a bit of your UX experience, is there anything you'd add to that, Nick?
Well, I mean, should we always be objective? I don't know about that. I think there are different ways of understanding what goes on in the world, and I think the mindset that we're encouraged to have as business analysts and that we're trained to have is a fairly mechanistic one about how people work, about how organizations work, and about how everything fits together like a great big machine. And you've mentioned techniques a couple of times already. There tends to be quite an emphasis amongst business analysts on techniques, and that ends, that can lead to a fairly sort of technocratic kind of approach to things. So I think we really need to balance that with the opposite way of thinking about things, which is thinking about things actually subjectively. But we need to see the world subjectively, as Anushka says, from the point of view of the people who are in the situation.
Yeah, and Penny makes a really interesting observation on the Q&A, which is objectivity even possible? Discuss. And and again, I'm quite fond of systems thinking. I've done a lot of reading and practicing around that, and a systems thinker would say no, because I mean you're always part of the thing you're observing type of thing. It's that old type of thing. So I suppose a good juncture or a good segue to make at this point is to actually really describe what we mean by anthropology. So I suppose I've got a view of what it is, but if we were to put some definitions around it, so I mean, Anushka, how would you? I know this is putting you on the spot, but the sort of elevator pitch. What is it, and why do people do it?
Well, the actual origins of anthropology started during the 1900s, and it was mainly like white privileged guys going around the world and exploring and seeing other cultures. And then as time kind of moved on, it like meandered into this other like field by this guy called Malinowski, and he was like the father of anthropology. And he would beforehand they would kind of observe from afar and make their own notes. And then this guy, the term was called off the veranda because he physically left his like makeshift home and became part of the community. And that was the massive like leap in anthropology. But the discipline is broken up into 4 different parts. So Malinowski specialized in social anthropology, so going into another community. And you have biological anthropology, so it's similar to archaeology, so going through bones and having the different aspects of the body, or even through temples or buildings that were once there. And then you have linguistics, so language that we all use now, even slang, all of that comes into it. And then you have archaeology, which is a discipline of anthropology.
Wow, so different sort of elements. And so you've got the linguistics, the archaeology, the sort of the biology, all of those elements to it. And I mean, I'll open this to anyone who wants to grab it. Similarities and relevance for business analysis. Who's going to grab that one?
I'm happy to jump in because that's sort of what I started with. And I think as you're talking there, Anushka, I figured sort of 2 of those things are pretty strong in business analysis. So understanding the society and really trying to become a part of it, as Malinowski says, and also the language that we use. I think we're all really familiar with, starting a project or joining a program as a business analyst and knowing that you've got to learn a whole new set of language to understand, just at the start to understand sort of the processes that you're trying to build and the tasks that people take on every day. And over time, you feel like you become a part of that society that you're studying, if you want to sort of draw that comparison. I've always felt that every team that I go into, I become a part of, and I go through a little grieving process when the project's done and I have to leave because I felt like they were my team. And I think that's really the approach that changed anthropology, was that become part of it to understand it rather than looking from the outside in. I'd love to get your thoughts on it, Nick, with far more experience in the particular user experience side.
Oh no, yeah, I mean, and we talk about going native, don't we? But you're always cautioned against spending too much time with the end users, because otherwise you'll go native and you'll cease to be able to see that situation objectively. But that's why I like, because that feels wrong to me. And I liked it when I started reading stuff about anthropology, and they talk about they have this notion that you need to achieve what they refer to as vulgar competence. Vulgar competence meaning you need to actually be good enough, you need to understand the job well enough that you could actually do it yourself. And when I was studying human-computer interaction, one of the books that really sort of blew my mind was Contextual Inquiry by Bayer and Holtzblatt. Very influential book. And there they talk about, rather than sort of interviewing people in meeting rooms and stuff like that, going and sitting with them at their place of work and behaving like an apprentice, trying to actually learn how to do the job. And as I understand it, the anthropological view on it is, or the ethnographical view is, you're not really qualified to describe what's going on until you've got to that point. I mean, I have to say, I remember at one point spending 8 months sitting in a dealing room of a Japanese securities house trying to understand how they trade all these financial instruments, and I still had no clue at the end of it, but I did my best, and I certainly find it absolutely fascinating.
Sure, linguistics came into that one quite strongly.
Well, yeah, absolutely, and that's the funny thing. The anthropology seems to blend into sociology on one side, linguistics on another side, all these social sciences. I certainly don't understand where the boundaries between them all are supposed to be. And I think analysing the language that people use is a really fascinating part of anthropology. And I think it's something that business analysts actually need to pay a little bit more attention to, really, listening to the language that people use carefully.
That's a really interesting point, Nick, and because the subtleties of language, and I mean, I suppose there's the sort of obvious, in inverted commas, differences using a term, to the same term, to mean different things. And I mean, I come from a financial services background, and I've learnt the hard way, whenever anyone says customer, ask what they mean. Because, you know, a customer can mean, in an insurance company, it can be an insurance broker, it can be the insured person, it can be a third party claiming against their insured, it can depends on who you're asking. But there's also the, almost, I guess, the nuance of the context where something is said can change the meaning entirely. Like I was looking at two, for very boring reasons, I was looking at DNR can mean do not resuscitate, or it can mean dictated and not read. And potentially you could imagine having that definition both used in a medical context, by a medical practitioner. So interesting. So we've got a question in from David, and David asks, he says, it's an interesting point as to how much a BA should become part of the culture they're working in, a balance between being in it enough to understand it, but out of it enough to question. Never get off the boat, he says. Actually, we probably just talked about that. Well, we have, but we can talk some more about it. And this comes back to the sort of going native type of thing. So, I mean, Zara, what would your view be on how close is, because you mentioned you go through that grieving process, but you do move on, and you then go on a fresh project or in a fresh domain. How close is too close for a BA?
It's a really good question. I think it's probably one of the biggest challenges I've faced in my career, sort of knowing how to keep a healthy distance. And we mentioned earlier about being able to see things from a different perspective, instead of, so as a business analyst, trying to remain completely objective and see things from other people's perspectives. And I think if you become part of something, if you assimilate the society and you feel that you're a part of it, it's very difficult to have that objectivity. You become emotionally attached, and that's just sort of a natural part of being human. So I think that's the point where you could probably recognize that you've gone too far, to say, I care about the outcome more than I should, and I want to put my own perspective in here rather than being the representative of someone else's. But I think for me, what's really interesting is that there's a concept of changing the society, changing the place that you're studying by being a part of it. So the other risk of that going native for me is if you then start to have an impact on the people around you and change what you were going to have a look at. And it's a concept in anthropology too. So it was another tie that I drew together there. Yeah, I mean, I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, Anushka, as a new BA. Have you had that opportunity yet to feel that closeness with the team, or have you been sort of cautioned on how to approach that?
My understanding of ethnography was you are within the community, but you're further enough away to still understand like your perspective of it. And I've kind of gone into my team, and my close team that I speak with on a daily, I do feel I've built that relationship up with, and that's really nice. I've now started my project, and I think I need to understand what's going on, I need to understand my stakeholders, but I need to remain further enough away to keep my own like bias from anything. But like naturally they're always there. The whole point is I understand them enough to be able to do my job, but also not put my own actual emotions into what's going on, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that really resonates with me. The understanding enough to understanding enough, but also being far enough away to question, to have that separation. It's a hard one to actually manage. Let's take another question. So Claire asks, how do you or can you bridge that gap in the virtual world? Because of course we're all here talking about, we're going, let's go and like live with the users type, or not users, but live with the stakeholders. That's actually, well, is it more difficult in a virtual world? Nick, how would you approach ethnography or anthropology in a virtual world?
Yeah, I mean, it is more difficult. I think, I don't think there's any doubt about that. It is more difficult. But that's not to say it's impossible or it's a lost cause. I mean, the thing is, we've all become very, very comfortable over the last 8 or 9 months with being online all the time. You know, we're all sitting around with Zoom open or Teams open or whatever thing it is open all the time. So you can actually participate in someone's daily work, their daily routine, you know, just as a matter of course, really. You can be there, a part of their, you know, part of their Zoom meeting or whatever it is all day. And no one will think twice about it. So in a way that's made it easier, because a lot of the research work that I've done in the past has necessarily been remote for various different reasons, but now people are more comfortable with the idea. So there's pluses and minuses, really, I think.
Yeah, I've got to say there's definitely something around everyone being at the same disadvantage. So for someone who's previously worked in a blended working environment where every single meeting had a remote participant at least, the opportunity for everyone to be remote. I've heard Penny say this before, Penny Pullen, who's joined us. Thanks, Penny. It's about getting everyone onto a level, and I think that helps as a sort of societal leveler, as a way of saying we're all in this together, we're all having the same issues, you know, maybe with the tech, maybe with the environment, but we're all in the same place. And another great advantage you can leverage right now is the fact that you've got little insights into people's lives by what's behind them on their call that you'd probably never see in the office. You know, you get to see things like how they dress, how they do their hair, the makeup, the jewelry, the sort of things they choose to wear. But now we get these little insights into people's lives that you could use as an opener to a conversation that gets you a little closer to someone. So I think that's a nice way of becoming part of the society that you wouldn't see if you're in the office.
That's really interesting. You perhaps, you know, start to see behind the mask. It's almost like everyone's masks dropped over the last few months. And yeah, and I mean, it's funny because as you were both speaking there, I was thinking, well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because we've assumed that anthropology is always about a physical space and a physical society, but actually, don't people live in virtual worlds? Don't we have a life in the real world and a life on our social media network of choice, which may or may not be the same? And extending that, maybe people have a similar virtual life on SharePoint and Teams and all the other collaboration tools that we play with. And of course, Zara, you mentioned Penny there. Penny Pullen, definitely worth following for the sort of virtual leadership stuff. Wrote a fantastic book called Virtual Leadership that's well worth getting your hands on. So a couple of comments. So Penny says, I agree, Zara, it's a level playing field and it's so much easier when we're all virtual. So absolutely agree there. And James says about anthropology, I think more generally, it enables us to bring viewpoints that are not heard. And as Dave Snowden talks about, giving voice to minority views as opposed to the dominant, often corporate viewpoint. So you don't find out what is really going on without empathy and becoming trusted by people. I think that's a really, really astute observation, because you do get that sort of, you know, those meetings where everyone agrees and then the meeting like 5 minutes later, it's like the meeting's never happened. So
minutes and you realize you all took a different understanding away.
Yeah. Okay, so let's take another question. Brenda says, as a BA, it's so important that we understand what's important to our stakeholders, and it can be hard to be neutral. Does the panel agree? So we've sort of touched on this, but it is interesting because there can be situations where we might vehemently disagree with our stakeholders on a personal level. Like it might be, I just think that's ridiculous what they're suggesting. Like, how can we be neutral? Who would like a crack at that one?
In the virtual world or in like the real world? Because I have no experience with the real world, but virtually, I know that I feel like dealing with stakeholders virtually is much more, well, personally for me, it's been easier, even though I haven't got anything to compare it to, because everything is behind this screen and there is almost like that blanket of security. Because you can kind of not mess up, but you can have little errors, but you can correct them later because you're not face to face with the person. So you don't have that norm social interaction that is usually there.
Yeah, you're completely right. And on the sort of the topic of remaining neutral, I think I mean, it's clear to me we need to question whether we really can, but I have to remind myself as a business analyst, I'm trying to be holistic. So I'm representing every stakeholder that I've spoken to or haven't. So I think it's less about those one-to-one interactions and more about how does this tie with what I've heard elsewhere? And does it have a consensus across, or are there differences? And then the hard bit is when I agree with one of the approaches and not the other, and I've got to take my feelings out of it and represent both.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is that balance, isn't it? And it's that, and having to play devil's advocate with our own, like we have to almost, it's interesting, isn't it? We have to play devil's advocate, like in inverted commas, devil's advocate to our stakeholders and to ourselves. We've got to be constantly saying, well, actually, am I carrying some baggage here, which is affecting my view, which is a really, really tricky place to be. So we have a comment from, and apologies if I'm mispronouncing your name here, I think it's Janez, who says, isn't it a bit sad that BAs mostly never end up using the great solutions that they have designed and implemented for their customers? I love this next bit. It's like baking a great cake without ever tasting it. Fantastic, I think. Yeah, but conversely, sometimes when it's been de-scoped because there's no budget, it's sort of like baking a disappointing cake. We've probably all been on some projects which have, through no fault of any, through a whole bunch of constraints have perhaps not gone so well, and we don't feel the pain. We haven't quite, the reality is we haven't got the skin in the game that the stakeholders actually using these things actually have. So let's move on. One thing I know we've talked a little bit about, but I'm really intrigued as to what sort of approaches anthropologists take. And we've talked about ethnography and Anushka, you mentioned the sort of archaeology and biology. Are there any other sort of approaches or techniques or anything that you think would be sort of relevant for BAs, or that you found is relevant for BAs?
I think just like in a world that is growing so diverse, you have to actively want to understand different people and be willing to put that time and effort in to understand that cultures are different and people are different. And that's why your perspective might clash, but that's absolutely fine. You just need to put the time and effort in to keep going with it, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Which again sort of underlines, I suppose, the importance of things like diversity and inclusion and actually making sure we've got the relevant voices being represented. Fantastic. So let's just pause there whilst we do this terrifying thing that I like to do about halfway through, which is where we have a look at the mural. And because it's on my other screen over there and my eyes aren't that good, I can't actually see what's written on it. So I'm just going to share the screen. When I can get the button up. So let's share the other screen. So over here. So, oh wow, loads. I could see there were loads. There really are loads. Let's get it on this screen as well. So we've got tacit knowledge. It has to help with that. Detach emotions, behave like an apprentice, real listening, observation. Our business analysts, technocrats. Isn't the BA allowed the perspective of their own, no bias? So a lot of, that whole bias, can we be not unbiased? Can we linguistics, biology, archaeology, how close is too close? So yeah, feels like this is about professional distance. So great, thanks to everyone who is contributing to that shared mural board. This is something that will really help us after you've been at the session, it will help you remember what's being discussed. I will just, for anyone who perhaps joined late, you might not have seen the link in the chat, so just bear with me. I will add that to the chat again now, just in case you weren't here when we kicked off. That way you can participate in the mural board as well. Okay, so let's have another look at the questions that have come in. We've got quite a lot of questions coming in, which is always a good sign. David says, has the panel noticed a difference in team culture between agile teams as opposed to waterfallers? As a BA, it certainly seemed easier to absorb into a team, for better or worse. I saw a lot of tribal behaviour within some sprint teams, which could get quite ... interesting. So any differences in culture between agile and waterfall? I mean, Zara, have you?
Yeah, that's a really tough question for me, because I've almost exclusively worked in agile, or what I hate calling waterfall.
Waterfall?
It's never gone truly waterfall. But David's point is really interesting there about the sort of tribal behaviors, because they're actively encouraged in agile. This idea of your Scrum team is your team, you create the microculture that you'd like to see. And the interplay between company culture and individual team culture I've found fascinating. So I found even just moving from agile team to agile team and moving between businesses, things are really different, and you have to go through that sort of learning like you would as an anthropologist joining a society for the first time. What is the language here? How do people communicate with each other? What's appropriate? What's not appropriate? Do I email or do I put it in Teams? Is it okay to phone somebody, or does that mean it's an emergency and that's going to really freak them out? Yeah, I don't know. I'd love to hear what people think on the waterfall side, because I've just not done that myself.
I mean, Nick, I'd imagine you've done your fair share of both. What would your view be?
Yeah, I have done a lot of both, and it's interesting, isn't it, that we've really been assuming up to now that the subjects of our study are, the business, the people in the business, but actually the people on the supply side, so to speak, the IT people and the analysts are fascinating subjects of anthropological inquiry. And I mean, I think that in agile, I would say the way I see it is that a lot of the culture of agile comes from developers. The people who invented agile were basically developers themselves, and it's something that's been popularized by developers. And I don't know, I don't want to sound too smug about this, but I would say that the business analysis community tends to be a little bit more, what can I say, a little bit more civilized sometimes than the developer community.
That's harsh.
If you go to a developer conference, a tech conference, they always find it necessary to have all these voluminous guidelines about how you must not behave, things you must not do at a tech conference. There's all this kind of harassment and stuff that goes on. There's this whole big issue about equality and so on in the dev world, which, speaking for myself, in the BA world, I just don't see any of those issues. It's a much more relaxing place to be. So that's my sort of explanation for the phenomenon that Dave is talking about, which I certainly do recognise.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? And I suppose, is there I suppose if projects, whether they're waterfall or agile, are almost like temporary communities, it's almost like there's an anthropological study of those as well, internally, and I do think it's interesting. I don't know if any of you have found this, but sometimes you work on a project team, you change a couple of team members, and actually the team changes. And of course it does, because there's that old expression: when you replace someone in a team, what you have is a new team. And that's sort of true. So lots of comments and questions coming in. So I'll cover some of the comments. So Paul says, not so much of a question, but an observation from Adrian's mention of systems thinking. Second order of cybernetics, which of course is observing systems as opposed to observed systems, was of course co-developed by the famous anthropologist Margaret Mead. So yeah, big thumbs up from that. I imagine a big thumbs up from Nick, because I know you're a fellow systems folk. Indy says the trick is for the BA to maintain enough objectivity so that we can stand back and help identify things like gaps and appropriate improvements. Which again is interesting, isn't it? That actually sometimes having just a little bit of separation means that we can spot things, almost because we're not experts, we can spot things that are hiding in plain sight.
There's a wonderful, sorry if I could interrupt for a moment, there's a wonderful description there of appropriate changes. Like I love that, particularly thinking about it from an anthropological sense.
Hard to say, isn't it?
Oh, it really is. But it's that idea of as we go in as business analysts, there's a change program. We are there to make a change happen and to contribute to that. So the assumption is that you're going to make a change, which means it's really difficult to say maybe we shouldn't be making a change. Actually, what they're doing does make sense in their context, and let's not change that, but let's think about the broader implications. And I think there is sort of an almost judgmental thing of, if you're going in and you're making a change, it's who gets to decide that that's the appropriate thing to do. So that was a really nice piece of phrasing there from Indy, I think it was. I really liked that, and just wanted to comment on that what is an appropriate change, and should we always be aiming to make a change on behalf of other people?
Yeah. That reminds me of a presentation Liz Calder gave called now having known it was the presentation, I can't remember the title of it. It was something like "We Can But Should We," or something along those lines, which is saying, there are things which are technologically feasible, and they might be desirable to some stakeholders, but actually, should we? There's a whole a whole ethical question there as well. So Penny adds that the virtual world is the real world. It's just not in person, which I think we've all certainly come to learn over these last few months. It is the real world. Tim says maybe there are different aspects to being neutral. Why shouldn't we challenge apparently daft ideas or suggest our own ideas to stimulate the thinking of our stakeholders? We can still remain neutral about the eventual outcome or decisions. So again, I suppose it's back to that sort of that challenging devil's advocate-y type role. So very, very interesting perspective there. So our next question comes from Nirav, and Nirav asks, how should we deal with diverse stakeholders? Or rather, how can we make sure as a BA we understand them correctly? Because potentially we've got a whole bunch of people from very different backgrounds. They may speak they may speak a physically, like an actual different language to us, but they probably speak a different business language to us. How can we make sure we're actually, we've actually got a common understanding and not the illusion of communication? I mean, Anushka, do you have any thoughts or tips on understanding our diverse stakeholders?
Personally, I don't have, the only thing I can suggest is listen. Listen, take notes, ask what they want, but get to know them as a person on a different level, not just a stakeholder. There is a person there. And if it is a cultural difference, that might come out a bit more if you are more, obviously not one-to-one, go for a coffee or whatever, but well, if you can, but really understand what this person wants, or have a virtual coffee, really just listen and really try to understand.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, Nick, any perspectives from your sort of UX take on diversity and different folk?
Well, I suppose, from a user experience point of view, I would always say, I tend to say some stakeholders are more important than others. And the typical business analyst would also say that, but my criteria might be different from theirs. So, very often, if you're doing stakeholder analysis as a business analyst, you'll do your good old pig, your power interest grid, and you'll say, if these people have no influence, we're going to ignore them, or we're going to, at the very, very best, we're going to keep them informed. Whereas with the people we are going to pay a lot of attention to are the people with lots of power and influence. I don't like that at all. And as a, with my user experience hat on, I would say actually it's the people on the front line, who are operationally affected by a change. They're the people that we actually need to be consulting the most about a change. It comes back to what James said earlier about making sure that everyone's voices are heard. I do think, there's a tendency sometimes in the thinking about business analysis to be a little bit too, taken hostage by senior stakeholders, really. So yeah, I think we need to understand them all, don't we? We need to understand them all. But in my book, one of the diagrams in there is a taxonomy of stakeholders, and it talks about or users rather.
What page?
I don't remember. Actually, I've just unfortunately, I've just mentioned the one place in the book where there's a typo. If you look very, very carefully, you'll find a typo in that diagram. But anyway, users are just one type of stakeholder, but they're the most important sort of stakeholder. And within that, you've got primary users and secondary users, and it's the primary users that are the most important ones. It's the people, whose jobs are directly affected by what you're doing that I think we need to pay the most attention to.
It's really interesting because as you were speaking there, Nick, I was thinking about how many decisions are made in comfortable meeting rooms that where the operational impact is somewhere completely different. And on an unrelated note, this reminds me, and I forget which book it was a book about cognitive biases that said, if you wanted people to make better decisions about retirement investment, get them to make that decision in a room that looks like an old people's home. Because actually getting you to look at what the future looks like or could look like, actually that can change your perspective on how much you invest now, which I thought was a really interesting way of thinking about it. So maybe if we're designing a process that's going to work in a buzzing call center, maybe we should design that process in a buzzing call center. I mean, it sounds so obvious now I say it out loud, doesn't it? Right? But interesting. So another question from James. James says, do you think anthropology encourages us not just to observe, but to create and present some hypothesis from those observations rather than neutrally feeding back what you found? So who would like that one? Do we create a hypothesis from our observations?
I'll jump in on that because I was really curious about this when I was taking the intro to anthropology. I was like, other than academically, which I don't want to just sort of shove to one side like this doesn't matter, but other than academically studying for the sake of learning, what is anthropology to the modern world? And I discovered that a lot of organizations, a lot of companies looking to make a change in a local area will use anthropologists and hire anthropologists and get them to go study the impact that change will have. So an example I can give is where mining is quite a big part of the sort of economy of Australia. If a community is going to be impacted by a mine being put into place, they'll send anthropologists into the community to sort of understand the impacts that it might have and the feeling about that change that's going to be made. So the hypothesis there would be the community will reject this unless we can find some way to make it work for them. So we go in, we study the society, we find out what they would like to get from the arrangement, and then we can go in and negotiate as an organization. I found that really, really fascinating. I think on the flip side, BAs trying to just neutrally study would be a really interesting thing for me. So instead of always going in with a change that you want to make, a piece of technology that's coming in or an organization design change, I'd love it if we could just go spend time with stakeholders just to find out about what's life like in their part of the organization. And we might discover some more interesting changes to make to the business that would never have come about another way.
Yeah, Anushka, anything you'd add to that?
I definitely agree with Zara. Like on the side of listening, if you get to then be if you get to observe them 24/7, you really understand what they're like and why they make those decisions and whether they have pressure from external sources around them. And going back to the power influence grid, if you did look at not just the main people that make the decisions, but if you went back to basics and you really asked what people on the ground level need, and although cost and time are a massive factor, if you could address those directly, I think it would have a huge impact. But for neutrality, I think it'd just be so cool to do that study. I'm just like, oh wow, I want to do it.
Yeah, we need to engineer a situation where we can all work together and do it somewhere, I think. But so our next question comes from Mary France, who asks, or who says, the biggest challenge I've found is bringing stakeholders together from different parts of the company who speak different languages and have a very different culture, and having to spend time clarifying terminology and language so they can understand each other. This is a case of where the BA is really working as a translator, not between IT and the business, but between different parts of a business who are very different from each other and therefore struggle to communicate and reach a consensus. Yeah, here to that one. How often have we felt that? And it is true, isn't it? Because we sort of talk about the language of the business. In fact, the whole the business thing's a bit of a myth, isn't it? It's not like there's not just one thing, and it's not like the boundaries are so clear. There's a playful comment from Tim that says, "How do you know that's the only one place there's a typo?" So I'm not going to. We won't dwell on that one. Okay, so let's see what else do we have here. We've got lots of questions. So Mark says, how in anthropology does the role of the innocent outsider generally get interpreted and categorized in the community being studied?
They're not always innocent. That's the thing. Like Malinowski massively got slandered, I think it was in the 80s, because he went in and he was like, oh, I'm not going to publish this, don't worry, these are my personal notes. And then he went like straight back home, published the book, and then the whole community absolutely got slandered. I read a book called Compassionate Cannibalism, and the same thing happened in Brazil. And it was basically, you would eat so I wouldn't eat my partner, but I could eat my partner's like parents because that's respectful. And this was it up until like 1954. This was still really relevant. And then these like missionaries came in and they were like, they wrote it all down, came back, published it. There was a massive outrage, and then the law was changed and they couldn't practice anymore. Like, it massively impacts. They are not innocent at all.
And to completely agree, but also completely counter that point, there is a book that's wonderful for this that I read following my course. I'm going to check it up here. I can put the link out for it later. The Innocent Anthropologist by Nigel Barley. And this is a guy who went honestly to change the way that anthropology does impact on cultures and how it's fair to the culture that it studies. So he was purely trying to understand the Douayas culture in Cameroon and Africa, and spent a couple of years living with them. And he called his book The Innocent Anthropologist because of all the mistakes he made by not knowing enough before he went in. But I think he used his ignorance well, because he became to that society someone to sort of laugh at. Oh, the white man's doing something funny again. He's asking a silly question. He doesn't know he should do that. And it's that same thing as business analysts using our ignorance and saying, I don't know why you do this that way. Can you just explain that for me? And really getting to the root of what people do and why they do it.
Getting to that root of the what and the why and the how and the how often and so
Yeah.
on. So John makes an observation. John says, it's interesting what Zara said about being embedded. I'm a permanent BA in a team, civil service. It's quite interesting how being a BA in a team permanently delivering change from project teams. So my customers brackets users are both the customers of my team and also my team itself. So coaching from the outside. So that's another interesting part, isn't it? Which I mean could be a whole nother webinar. Really, is it sort of like depends on where you are as a BA, because you can be a sort of product in a product environment, in a project environment. You could be part of the business. You could be as part of a change team. You could be a consultant coming in. So all of those things presumably are going to affect how people respond to you. Because if you're part of the business function, they might respond to you one way. If you're from a consultancy coming in from the outside, they might, treat you very, very differently. Tricky.
And being a consultant, I imagine, gives you those opportunities to decide which character you're going to play in this organization, what's appropriate to the brief you've been given. I bet Nick and Adrian, you both have some war stories of trying to be something going into an organization and maybe being found out.
I've not been found out yet.
I don't know about that either, but I certainly do very much enjoy going into different organizations and being able to see different cultures, because the culture in every organization is completely different. And a lot of the stuff that I read about anthropology and ethnography and so on is interesting to me from that point of view, reflecting on how I always come in from the outside. One of the first books I read about ethnography was one called The Professional Stranger. And well, that's what I am, I am a professional stranger. I go into organizations, no one has a clue who I am, I make all these appointments to see people and they're thinking, who is this guy? What does he want? The downside of it is that people expect you to have the answers. And people are always rather surprised when I say, you know what? Who is the expert on designing new processes for this organization? It's not me, it's you. And people are always very taken aback by that. And I think they're thinking, well, in that case, why are we paying you? But we don't talk about that.
Tricky area, always a tricky area. But okay, so I mean, I suppose just before we move on, it'll be worth, and we'll sort of start to draw to a conclusion very soon. But what would be interesting to know is why care, right? Because like there are lots of different disciplines which intersect with business analysis. But why should we care that anthropology potentially intersects, or we can learn stuff from it? So, I mean, Anushka, why do you think that BAs should care about anthropology?
I think it's such a part of your daily life without you realizing it. Like from you sitting on your chair or whether you're sat on the floor, like every aspect you do. So why not put it into like your business? Why not like put it into your work and just explore something that you're almost already doing? Like just enhance what you've got. So it's not like you have to go out your way and read a book or whatever, or you could just like read Zara's article, like read, little plug, but like just do something little and then like see what spirals from that. Like with the like 64 people having this conversation, like you're learning something new. I don't know, I just have a curiosity to like do stuff and learn stuff. So like why not put anthropology into your work and learn about yourself as well as like those around you?
Yeah, so Zara, why would you say we should care?
First of all, I love your enthusiasm, Anushka, and I completely agree with everything you said. I think for me, this comes down to an acceptance of the diversity that we have in our organizations and the lack of ability to sort of truly understand that ourselves. So I want to build diverse teams so that I can help to understand my customer, my user, my world around me better. And so in thinking about how do we bring in that understanding, that empathy for diversity, I just couldn't help but notice that anthropology has been attacking that probably for longer than anybody. First from a judgmental stance and now from a much more neutral one, but just the idea of the techniques that this industry came up with were all around finding people who weren't like you, becoming close enough to them to understand them and replaying that back. So for me, that's a massive win on the diversity front, which is something I just care particularly about.
Yeah, definitely. Nick, anything to add?
Well, I think, you know, if you want to bring about change in organizations, that's what we were talking about earlier. If you want to bring about change successfully, I think you really need to be quite arrogant to think that you can get it right just by employing a load of techniques that we think of as business analysis techniques. You know, there are other ways of looking at the world, and it's the people that are directly impacted by the change. As I said before, those are the people whose way of seeing the world actually has the greatest bearing on the situation. So yeah, we can go away and think about what we observe. We can go away and think about you know, what we've seen and what we've heard, and we can create hypotheses, we can create models and so on. But that's you know, that whole process is about abstracting away and creating something abstract, which is rather kind of bloodless, you know, something abstract. You have to do that if you want to communicate with software developers. You have to give them something abstract, but it loses meaning that way. And I think doing ethnography and things like that redresses the balance really, and it, you know, it brings that human side back in, and it's not, you know, I'm making it sound warm and fluffy, but it's not warm and fluffy. It's about a reality check really. You know, if you understand the people and the environment, you're more likely to create something that actually works. Simple as that.
Yeah, definitely. So just before, just a couple of questions before we wrap up. One very, very quick one, probably a really difficult one to answer. But Fabrizio says, I see that as BAs we can learn a lot from anthropology. May the opposite happen too? There's a really interesting question. Could anthropologists learn from BAs? I mean, what Anushka, briefly, what do you think?
I have very little experience. I've only been in my job like 4 months, so I'm gonna pass this question along.
4 months of good experience is more, you know, that's a very firm foundation. But I mean, Zara or Nick, would either of you like to have a view on that.
I can give the very wishy-washy answer, which is everybody can learn from everybody. If you're not in a mode of learning, you're doing something wrong. It's that old adage of if you're the smartest person in the room, you're in the wrong room.
Yeah.
Always put yourself in a position of learning. So I think, yes, absolutely, anthropologists could learn something from BAs, but getting exposure to each other, I think, is the challenge to overcome.
Fantastic. Well,
thank you.
We're very nearly at the end of our allotted time. So my final question to each of you individually is in 30 seconds or less, what would your biggest takeaway, your biggest, point for people who are dialing in to take away? So Nick, what would you hope that people would take away from the session today?
I hope that people will think a bit more about the value of really paying attention to what you see and what you hear when you're observing your stakeholders or your end users. Really paying attention in minute detail to everything you see and hear.
Fantastic. So that paying attention and that detail. Anushka?
I think in a world that's going more technological and more everything seems to be on a screen or a phone or whatever, that kind of for me has been taking a massive step back from society. So to be able to learn about other people through books, through podcasts, through things online that you can just connect with and understand, but you don't have to actually be there. That's been my way to kind of escape into a new community. And although I don't fully understand it because I'm not that person, it's a massive insight that I've been able to put myself in without having to actually be there or not be there because of a pandemic.
Yeah. Fantastic. Excellent. Zara?
It's hard to follow those two.
It really is, isn't it?
I think for me, it's that we need to remember that behind all of these sort of clusters that you're given, like go and speak to the sales team or go and translate this to development, there are people there. And so if we think about our roles as business analysts as getting to understand people so that we can understand why they do what they do, so we can understand what needs to change, that for me is the core. So if you think of yourself more as a business anthropologist, then you think of yourself as an observer to something that's happening, and a person who has to stay true to what they've learned and treat those people well. And I think that's really important in business, particularly now as we spend more time on screens, like Anushka said. It's so easy to distance yourself from there being a person at the other end of that.
It's going to be kind of weird making eye contact with people again in the real world, isn't it?
Yeah.
When it comes back, it's like a picture of myself. How can I have a conversation? I've forgotten how to do it. But, well, fantastic. I mean, Zara, Anushka, Nick, thank you so much for taking time out. I am absolutely certain that people will want to know more. In fact, we haven't been able to answer all of the questions, which is a sign of how enthusiastic people are about this topic. I'm sure people will want to follow you, know more about what you do. They might even want to, ask questions, follow-up questions if you're okay with that. How's the best way for people to connect with you? Is it sort of LinkedIn or elsewhere? So Zara, how can people connect?
LinkedIn, though I don't check it as regularly, and Twitter all the time. I'm at Zara Sheldrake on Twitter and LinkedIn /Zara Sheldrake. I'll put those in the chat now.
Cool. And Anushka?
LinkedIn. LinkedIn's probably the best and only way to contact me.
Excellent. And Nick?
Yeah, LinkedIn. I used to be the only Nick Voil in the world, but there's now one other Nick Voil in Australia. But I'm still quite easy to find. And on Twitter also, I'm at Nick Voil.
Fantastic. Well, I've just popped those URLs because I predicted that LinkedIn might be a popular choice. So I've just popped those in the chat as well. So just before we end, so a massive thank you to Zara, Anushka, and Nick for taking time out to do this. Just before we end, I've just got a couple of announcements before we end. First off is we have some other events coming up. So in fact, in just 2 days' time, on the 14th of January, there is the next edition of BA Fringe. Now, if you've not come across BA Fringe before, it's sort of webinar-y, but it's more TV showy. And it's terrifying to produce and to present, but it's fun. So it's an hour We've got 4 guests. We have Debbie Paul is talking about service design. We have so we got a whole bunch of different topics, different speakers on there. So do check that out. If you click through on the link, it tends to sell out. It hasn't quite sold out yet. There are just a few places left. Click through. That's always good fun. And then just on the off chance that you're looking for some training in strategic business analysis, this next one's a paid for workshop, but it's currently at the early bird pricing. There's a strategic business analysis workshop on the 8th of February, which is being run by me. So yeah, so why anyone would want to spend 4 hours in a workshop with me, I have no idea, but people sometimes do. So take a look at that. There's also a couple of upcoming events that will be in the email that will go out after this, which is a BA Open Mic Night, which is your chance to take the virtual stage for a 3-minute riff on anything of your choice, and also a webinar about dissent in organisations, actually having standing up and sort of playing to some extent that devil's advocate role. So do take a look at those as well. But now it's time for me to say again, thank you again to Zara, Anushka, Nick for a fantastic, really thought-provoking presentation. And thank you to everyone who has tuned in, whether you are watching live or indeed the recording. So stay safe and hope to see you all on another webinar again soon. Bye for now.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.